you know, Russia, Germany, and the United States, the way the U.S. and Russia and other countries did with the Kyoto. Just a few have to sit out. If 160 say yes and 4 say no, and those 4 are China, the United States, and Brazil, say, it's over. So Copenhagen can't be just about explaining the problems of environmentalism and trying to do cap and trade. It's got to be about creating institutions capable of enforcing decisions that have to be made if we're going to survive. And I'm pessimistic only in the sense that we're up against a dominant paradigm that's associated with virtue and good things, with rights and democracy. The very notion of democracy is all tied up with the nation state. And no one's figured out how you take democracy out of the nation state and globalize it. Until we figure out how to either globalize democracy or democratize globalization, I don't see how we can in Copenhagen deal with these issues.
Yeah, I would like to respond to virtually everything that has been said. Oh yes, I'm Anthony Hill, and I've been around in the system since the 1960s. And I do recall when we used to have problems getting the US delegation to even accept there was interdependence among states. Now, the point I'm making is this. When we speak of interdependence, I see it as interdependence of policy, because it is policy at the national level that will move us to some semblance of agreement at the multinational level. I agree, as I said, with most everything that has been said. My problem is that we throw out concepts, and these concepts are like cluster bombs. They create a lot of confusion and damage. Climate justice, structural adjustment, globalization, etc. Now, how is it that Copenhagen should be like all the others when in fact Copenhagen is quite different from all the others? We have managed in this bureaucracy, this bureaucratic town of Geneva, who Professor Barber hasn't visited, which is a great pity, where interdependence ought to be started if we want to have a multinational sense of coherence of policy. The fact is that we were able to mobilize the scientific community, which has brought us to a consensus, and that consensus is what will be at Copenhagen. I am myself pessimistic because I don't see the coherence in the policy that comes out of the multilateral system. So the point I'm getting at is, if we could just cut down on the cluster bomb approach of concepts, climate justice, precautionary principle, all of these things have merit in themselves, and we focus on one thing for the moment, which is how does any institutions in which we are gathered, in which we do express a lot of ideas and thoughts, how can we get one thing agreed? How could we mobilize what we call the social scientists to develop some semblance of consensus to match the scientific consensus on 350 or 450 parts per million? And the question really is, we have exactly that problem here in Geneva. ILO, WHO, WMO, WTO, the Bretton Woods institutions, and every one of the heads of agencies, and I speak very frankly because I've now retired as an ambassador, every one of those agencies are run like little fiefdoms in their little sectors. And if we don't break that, and we don't get the genuine independence of policy, then we are going to continue the same way that we have for quite a little while. Thank you.
I'm very conscious of the fact that time is unbelievably short, and I really want to pass it on, but I want to try and respond to those two questions together and link it back to a lot of what we were saying earlier, perhaps. The core dilemma is, of course, the fact that in as much as we have sovereign states that constitute the international system, politicians, whether they are democratically elected or not, are nationally accountable. And as long as they are nationally accountable, the way in which they posit the trade-offs that everyone will bring to the table in Copenhagen is in the context of their national economies, national societies, and the ruling politics of the day. It is not possible to go beyond a certain limit if you intend to get re-elected in 4 or 5 years' time. If you intend to get re-elected in 12 months' time, by definition, it's that much more difficult. Now, one could waffle about this for ages and make it much more complicated, but that's probably the simplest definition of the core issue. And in a world in which we are authentically interdependent in many ways and systemically connected in many ways where true interdependence is not the right concept, the concept of national political accountability is inadequate. It's not wrong, it's just not a sufficient mechanism for enabling us to address the challenges. Now, I disagree with Ben on one thing. Copenhagen can't be about global governance because that's not what Copenhagen is about. But do we need a debate on global governance? Of course we do. It's just that it can't be in Copenhagen. So I want to, within that framework, just come quickly back to Don's question. I'm pessimistic about Copenhagen for two reasons. One is that I don't think that the level of commitment to specific cuts is likely to be attainable in the midst of an economic recession when no politician wishes to foreclose growth options by committing to particular targets that are, in a certain sense, close enough to be material within the span of a politician's lifetime. I also think that unless there are significant understandings, which may occur in the G2 context, significant understandings between the United States and China, I don't think that either one of the two is going to step up to the plate in a way that potentially will move the ball downfield and enable us to move toward aspiration. So how could that possibly be addressed? It could be addressed by defining two sets of targets for Copenhagen. One are fixed commitments, as currently envisaged, and the others might be not for the 2050 target, but possibly for something like 2030, which is far enough out to, let's say, create a wider range of possibility. A second set of aspirational targets. I think there is some reason to believe that we will be able to make more progress in the course of the next 5 or 6 years than we're likely to make by the end of 2009. Copenhagen is in a certain sense its own worst enemy now, I think. Nothing we can do about it. It has to happen. But it would be a disaster, in my opinion, to have agreements on targets, on commitments, which are completely inadequate relative to the baseline requirement. It would be much better to have formal commitments and aspirational targets with the opportunity to review within 2 years and perhaps 3 years after that, so that we create, as it were, a progressive framework leading to that. I couldn't agree more on the silos. I think it's the domain issue, in a certain sense, that Ben was speaking to earlier. I think as long as you separate out into every one of these particular dimensions international organizations and replicate the domain specificity on that level, you worsen the problem. You create vertical and horizontal silos, and that self-evidently serves no purpose.
I think Mr. Hill said he was sorry I hadn't visited Geneva. Is that what you said? I've lived in Switzerland for 3 years. I lived in Courcelles-sur-Chavannes here. Je parle français. So I'm not a stranger to these parts of the world. I've also, some people I think suggest, as always happens, that if you talk ideas, you must be somewhere up here. And those of us with real experience, I worked in the Clinton administration. I was Howard Dean's foreign policy advisor. I'm currently consulting governments in Syria, the United Arab Emirates, Libya, Turkey, and elsewhere. So I have a fairly strong practical sense as well, although I do insist on the importance of ideas. I'm a progressive. I guess environmentalists generally have to be progressives. The right has had one extraordinary advantage over the left in the last 40 or 50 years. They take ideas seriously and we don't.